Joy. There's something about joy that seems elusive in these days. And yet, the 10th practice of revolutionary love and the core practice that sustains all the others in this series we've been doing is joy. Joy is the thread that weaves itself throughout the tapestry of all the other practices. Wonder. When we wonder about someone else, it can bring us joy. When we grieve, that's an oxymoron, isn't it? Grief and joy. And yet, how many times at funerals have we seen families gather in fellowship after the funeral and have roarous laughter, have times when they share stories and feel joy? To listen to others can bring joy. Joy is that which holds our rage in check and is the result of our rage when we can fight alongside of others. All of these practices that Valerie Kaur writes about are stitched together with joy. And so I want to ask you, when have you felt joy? What was the instant that brought you joy? That's a real question. It's not rhetorical.
Birth of a child.
The birth of a child, a grandchild. What else? Watching animals play. Rainbows. Sunrises. Birthdays.
Music.
Whoa, wait a minute. Travel. Music. Christmas. Family. Gardens. Fun. Sunsets. Yes. So when you feel this joy, when you felt joy at each of these things, what did you do to nurture that joy? Did you dwell in it for a moment? Did you let it permeate you? Or did you just try to get rid of it right away? We want to dwell in it. We want to practice it. And what is the feeling deep down inside that joy brings? When you are joyous, what happens to your tension levels? They drop. What happens to your anxiety or your fear levels?
You release.
They go down. All of these things that we've been talking about for the last 9 weeks about building and creating this world filled with revolutionary love come together with joy. So, I'm going to tell you what your practice for this week is, what your homework for this week is, before I get any further. I want you to notice this week what brings you joy. And then I want you to listen to your body while that joy is still bubbling inside of you. What brings you joy? What helps you to hold on to that joy? What is it that you might call your relationship with joy? Is it fleeting like a dream, or is it sustaining like that morning caffeine? Is it something that you look for and practice? And what do you need to do to develop that as a practice moving forward? And you'll know why I'm asking those things in just a moment. So, in the Psalm, and I love this translation of the Psalm from the Inclusive Bible, it talks about joy being the result of the people returning to Israel. Now, these are not the people who left Israel. They are instead the children and grandchildren of those who left, because they were gone for 70 years. But they'd heard from their parents and grandparents what the homeland was like, what Jerusalem was like. And they were freed by Darius to go back to Israel and be home again. How many of you have ever gone back to your childhood home? Yeah? And what bubbles up in you when you get home, when you see it again? Memories. What a surprise. Nostalgia. These people didn't have any of those to fall back on. They only had the stories of their parents and grandparents. And so they had to try to relive what it was like. And they had this nostalgic idea of what Jerusalem should look like, and they got there, and it was in shambles. Because the well-educated and all the good craftsmen had been carried off to Babylon. And when they got there, the city was in ruins because no one had kept up the temple. It had been knocked down, and they could never rebuild it to what Solomon had built it as. And yet, they felt joy. Our mouths were filled with laughter then, our tongues with songs of joy. And they go on to say, yes, Yahweh has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. We're filled with joy. And then they turn around and say, now let our captive hearts free. Because in their minds and in their practice, they were still used to being captives in Israel. They needed their hearts freed the way the wadis fill with water and just flood forth, even though they've been dusty desert paths before the rain. They say then those who now sow tears will reap shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping as they carry their seed for sowing will come back with shouts of joy as they carry their harvest home. They went home and they found joy. They went home and they found that they had to practice that joy because the reality around them was not joyous and promised a lot of work. Practice is what makes joy happen. No, let me rephrase that. Practice is what experiencing joy is about. We have to look for that which brings us joy. In a world where the news is so often depressing, in a world where little things always seem to go wrong, in a world where we have been pushed down for so long we're not sure what looking up looks like, we have to practice finding joy. Hence, this week's homework assignment. Choosing to be joyful for these Israelites going back to Jerusalem was a revolutionary act. The world around them was not great. What they had to do to rebuild could never live up to the stories they had heard. Letting joy, choosing to let joy in, was a revolutionary act. Joy is not selfish or indulgent. It's a core practice that we can access even in the most difficult moments. We can't force it, but we can create moments to be present in our own aliveness. This is the practice of letting joy in. Joy is not the absence of grief or difficulty. Rather, it's accessing our feelings of aliveness, whatever the moment we're in. And like all the other practices of revolutionary love, joy is a collective process as well as an individual process. We can choose to nurture our joy and the joy of others in our communities. We can choose to labor in joy as we struggle for justice. Joy is what sustains us in our labors and returns us to everything good and beautiful and worth fighting for. Valerie Kaur writes, I believe laboring in joy is the meaning of life. This morning, we're going to try to practice that joy. You've all been given noisemakers. You've all been given something to make a ruckus with, and I'm expecting you to make a royal ruckus because we never do it that way. I really want you, as we come forward with our pledges, to celebrate those who are coming forward, and I'm going to give you a pattern on how to do that. Not yet, though. Because in good times and in bad, God has given us joy. That's why Jesus sums up the Beatitudes by admonishing us to rejoice and be glad, even when we're reviled or persecuted. I confuse the two words. That's why the great composer Beethoven was able to compose the Ninth Symphony, even though he was stone deaf. It was a work of sheer joy. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. could say with joy in the face of death threats and violent racism, "I have been to the mountaintop and I have seen the promised land." May we too know and experience the fullness of God's joy. For in this joy, we discover God's presence everywhere and at all times and places. In this joy, we discover the meaning and purpose and goal of our lives, as well as that of all of creation. So this morning, we're going to practice in community the joy of giving, the joy of committing to promises to help the ministries of this church and to help us replace this sound system and these lights. This morning, we're going to practice joy as we encourage others as they come forward. And they too will encourage us as we come forward. So let us practice joy, not just today, but every day. Amen.